I spent a good bit of time thinking about how to approach some of the topics I'm going to bring up, and I think I'm just going to follow along with the book. I left off last time with the philosophers, and some of the questions these philosophers raised, we can no more answer than they could. For all of our knowledge of science, the sophists, I left off with Socrates. The sophists, they said, hey, we can't explain the universe, so it's wrong to try. On a personal note, I think, hey, at least we can try. We might not can explain the universe, but we can at least, we don't know what we can explain and what we cannot. All right. They did believe that the one aspect that was worth study was human behavior. To me, studying human behavior is more chaotic than studying the universe. At least parts of the universe have some kind of order to them. But if all of you were machines, you'd always answer the same questions right on the same test, and all of you make the same grade because you're sitting in the same classroom with the same teachers, so all of you should make the same grade. Except that you're not machines. All right. Which takes us back to Socrates. This subject I'm about to approach is most difficult, and I think I'll do what I said earlier. I'm going to jump ahead just a little bit to family life. I'm looking at page 110 and 112. I think I have to give this part of the lesson first before I proceed with these three men, Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. All right, in general, the Greeks considered women that their place was in the home. In other words, they did not have any place in politics. Their ideal place was in the home, and therefore they had very little freedom. They were expected to marry and bear children, and they were especially expected to bear male children because, as I've already mentioned in connection with Pericles, only male children could inherit the estate. Now, again, until a fairly recent time, folk, and we're going to run into this again when we come to studying the French kings, because the French kings in the Middle Ages wanted a wife who would bear male children, so how could they tell if a wife would bear male children? Well, they would pick a woman who had a lot of brothers, and they figure, a woman who had a lot of brothers, that's how someone would look at me like, hey, what are you talking about? Well, it sounds nuts. It sounds crazy to us, but they believed you had a woman who had a lot of brothers, that she would be more likely to produce a male child than a woman who had a lot of sisters. Now today, we, according to our present knowledge of reproduction, the male determines the sex of the offspring and not the female. But again, they did not realize this. They believed the woman somehow determined the sex of the offspring. But they wanted women to bear male children. Now, Spartan women now were a little bit of an exception because the men stayed in the barracks till they were 30. Spartan women had a lot more freedom than did the women of the rest of the Greeks. Now I'm looking at page 112 at the bottom. Male homosexuality was considered the ideal, particularly homosexual relationships between men and young boys. This was the way that they felt like, and your book explains it, so I hope we won't have to go into any detail. This is the way that they believed that men learned how to interact in the real world. They saw no issues in the family life between being married. In other words, a typical aristocratic male would get married and by his lawful wedded wife have children who were considered legitimate. But he saw nothing wrong with having a boy whom he particularly liked and engaging in a sexual relationship with him. Now, this went on particularly in Roman times, where your 5 good emperors Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antonius Pius, and Marcus Aurelius, every one of these men were homosexual lovers of the predecessor. In other words, if an emperor would pick a boy he really liked very well and train him to be emperor, and this was the way that they advanced and got their promotions through the way that a young boy could advance himself. Now, folk, each of you can make up your mind for yourself what you think about the idea. I mean, even in 21st century America, this kind of relationship is outlawed. But they considered it the norm, the ideal. All right, I have to just get that out of the way before I get back to Socrates. It is believed that Socrates was himself homosexual, but he tried to fight it. And he believed that his demon buddy, I mean, he claimed to be buddies with a demon who whispered things into his ear, and his demon buddy was what kept him from the young boys, and these young boys would come after him because he was such a seemingly brilliant teacher. And also to help fight it, he married and had 3 sons. We know the name of his wife, the name of his 3 sons. Now, about his wife, later sources, I mean secondary sources, have said that his wife was a shrew. But the 3 original sources we have, Plato, Xenophon, and Thucydides, do not say anything like that about her. In other words, the men who might have known her never said she was hard to get along with, but the later sources, secondary sources, who might have had access to sources that we don't have, said that she was a difficult woman to get along with. But anyway, he had 3 sons. He might have successfully overcome his homosexual urges. But Plato, who was one of his pupils, justified homosexuality and said it was okay. In the case of Aristotle, who came next, Aristotle didn't hardly, I mean, he was homosexual, he didn't hardly mention the subject. About women, I'll get to what these men thought about women later. Socrates believed strongly that women should be under subjection, and he bemoaned the fact that the women he saw in his day were not obedient to husbands. Now, I have spent years and years going over a webpage about Socrates, and one time I ran into a man from New England who was an expert on Socrates. He said everywhere he goes, people find out he's an expert on Socrates. They ask him one question: did Socrates really say give people too much freedom and they would start demanding some kind of a dictatorship? He said, all right, I'm going to put him away of what Socrates allegedly said through Plato. He said that he lived in a world, Socrates, where that even the animals did not obey their masters, the children did not obey their fathers, the wives did not obey their husbands, and everything in Greece, I mean particularly in Athens, was just disorder and chaos. And he clamored and longed for the days when it was order. Now, he is suspected of having been a real admirer of Sparta, because in Sparta they still had some kind of law and order. Where he was from in Athens, there seemed to be no law and order. Now, again, folk, we have cases where in my country, I mean our country, United States, a lot of college professors were admirers of the Soviet Union when I was a kid. And a lot of them still are highly pro-communistic. Yes, when I was at UT, I had a Marxist professor, Dr. Paul Peekney by name. He wouldn't mind me telling me he's a Marxist because he was overtly, openly Marxist. A lot of people living in the Soviet Union were admirers of the United States. You tend to think the grass is greener on the other side until you get over there. A lot of persons who left the Soviet Union and came to the United States found out they didn't like it here. And a lot of them went back home, the most famous person being Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Found out that, hey, this was not such a great country to live in after all, and they went back. And a lot of persons, most famous being Lee Harvey Oswald, who left the United States to go to the Soviet Union, found out he didn't like it there, and came back here. Anyway, Socrates might have been an admirer of the Spartan state. All right. Having said that, I'll get back to Socrates and his beliefs. Again, the charge that got him killed was officially the charge of corrupting the youth. And during the trial, he said, hey, Plato is my favorite pupil. Did I ever corrupt Plato? There was no real answer given, but the people of Athens feared him. Not so much because he was friends with a demon. The Athenian people didn't seem to be bothered with that so much, but they feared him because they were afraid that he was questioning their religion, their values, their morality, questioning everything about them. And he was making every case in court. He was making the bad case appear to be the better case and the good case appear to be the worser. And the people finally decided they'd had enough of him, condemned him to death. And it was said on the appointed day he drank the hemlock. He had this to say about death. He said, either I'll become a god or I'll just simply be annihilated, I don't know which. Keep in mind, he was already 70 years old. And he said, at 70, I no longer can run as fast as I once could. Young men who once time I could beat, now beat me. I can no longer wrestle as well as I once could. The young men who once I could beat, now they beat me. And he said, all I have to look forward to in the next maybe 8 or 10 years, how much time I have left, is my mind going bad and losing control of my bowel and bladder functions, having to walk with a cane or being completely unable to walk at all. He said, I have nothing much left to look forward to except death, so why not get it over with now? So some of his friends told him of a plot they had hatched to try to secure his escape and get him to Sparta, where he'd be safe. He said, no, doing this would be wrong. And on a given day, he cheerfully drank the hemlock and died. And upon his death, the people of Athens, I might say, started looking at each other and said, hey, we killed a saint. We made a martyr out of him. And they have regretted that from that day till this. All right, and now, let me pause. Any of you have studied Socrates? Have any other comments, questions? I've heard that one of the teachers here teaches about Socrates a lot. When I was at UT taking Greek history, our professor gave one whole lecture to Socrates, and regretfully, the notes I took have been lost over the last 40 years. But he said Socrates is a myth. There's a big bunch of myths that sprung about him and a whole lot of sayings about him that it's difficult to determine what's true and what isn't. He's called a free thinker by the free thinkers, and yet he was a very extremely spiritually minded man.